What if everything you believed about your past was built on a lie? And what if that lie was the only thing keeping you going? Jacob Sullivan never thought his world could collapse twice in a single lifetime. But the night his family barn burned to the ground, the past he clung to for comfort crumbled into ashes. Little did he know, this tragedy would ignite a journey of discovery, sacrifice, and redemption, the likes of which no one in his small Kansas town could have foreseen. If you're ready to dive into this heart-stirring tale of hope and heartbreak, stay tuned and make sure to follow us for the rest of the story. Jacob Sullivan, just shy of his 12th birthday, sat on the porch steps of his modest farmhouse, staring at the Kansas horizon. The golden fields stretched endlessly, promising a freedom he had never known but desperately longed for. His mother, Evelyn, had always been his anchor, a quiet but fierce woman who worked tirelessly to make ends meet. She often told him stories of his father, John, a man Jacob had never met but idolized from her vivid descriptions. He was a rider like no other, she would say, her voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. When he mounted a horse, it was as if they were one. Evelyn never spoke about why John had left, but she kept a small chest locked in the barn, telling Jacob it held his father's legacy. But that chest and everything else was gone now. The fire broke out late one October night. Jacob woke to the smell of smoke and his mother's frantic cries. Flames devoured the barn, roaring as if fueled by memories too heavy to bear. Evelyn tried to save the chest, but the fire's heat pushed her back, leaving them helpless to watch as the structure collapsed. In the morning, Jacob combed through the smoldering remains. Among the ashes, he found a charred piece of metal, a horseshoe with the initials JT engraved on it. "Mom," he whispered, holding up the artifact. "What's this?" Evelyn's face paled. She took the horseshoe from him with trembling hands. "It's your father's," she said, her voice barely audible. "He always carried this." As a reminder of where he came from, Jacob studied her expression, a mix of sadness and something else. Fear, perhaps. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" Before she could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. Standing on the porch was Mr. Halston, the bank manager. He carried an air of authority and coldness that made Jacob's skin crawl. "Evelyn," Halston said, tipping his hat. "I came to discuss the loan." Evelyn's shoulders slumped. Jacob knew they were struggling, but the way Halston spoke made it clear they were on the brink of losing everything. "Give me a little more time," Evelyn pleaded. "I can figure something out." Halston shook his head. "Time's a luxury you don't have. If you can't pay by the end of the month, the farm will go up for auction." As Halston left, Jacob clenched the horseshoe tightly in his fist. He didn't know how, but he swore to himself he'd save their home and uncover the truth about his father. A week later, Jacob heard about a horse auction in a nearby town. He convinced Evelyn to let him go, insisting he'd just watch. But when they arrived, his heart stopped. In the corner of the corral stood a thin, battered horse with a dark coat that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Its ribs showed, and its eyes carried a deep sadness. Most bidders ignored the animal, deeming it worthless. But Jacob felt something stir inside him. "That one," he whispered to his mother. Evelyn looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Jacob, we can barely afford to feed ourselves, let alone a horse." "I'll take care of it," Jacob promised. "I'll train it. We'll make it strong again." When the auctioneer called out for bids, silence fell over the crowd. Jacob hesitated, then raised his hand. $5. Snickers erupted around him, but the auctioneer shrugged. "Sold, to the young man for $5. Evelyn sighed, shaking her head as Jacob approached the horse. He named it Thunder, for the faint rumble he felt when he touched its side, as if the animal carried a storm within. Training Thunder proved harder than Jacob imagined. The horse was skittish, limping from an old injury, and resisted every attempt at taming. Neighbors mocked him, calling him the boy with the broken horse. One afternoon, Jacob sat on the ground outside the barn, tears streaming down his face. "Why won't you trust me?" he asked Thunder. The horse huffed, as if mocking him. "Jacob." He turned to see Rosie, an elderly widow who lived down the road. She held a basket of freshly baked bread and a gentle smile. "Thought you could use some company," she said, sitting beside him. Rosie had always been kind to Jacob, but she rarely spoke of her past. That day, however, she surprised him. "I knew a rider once," she began, staring into the distance. "He had a horse just like yours. Everyone doubted him, too, but he proved them all wrong." "Who was he?" Jacob asked, curious. Her eyes met his, filled with a knowing sadness. "Someone who lost his way." Before Jacob could press further, Rosie handed him a piece of paper. "This might help." It was a faded diagram of a training technique. Jacob studied it, feeling a flicker of hope. Weeks passed, and under Jacob's care, Thunder began to heal. The horse gained strength and confidence, surprising everyone who had written it off. Jacob, too, changed. He became more determined, more resilient, driven not just to save the farm but to honor the legacy he barely understood. But just as things seemed to be improving, a stranger arrived at their farm late one evening. He was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority. "You're Jacob Sullivan, right?" the man asked. "Yes," Jacob replied, wary. The man handed him an envelope. "Stop looking for your father," he said, his voice cold. "Some truths are better left buried." Jacob's heart raced as he opened the envelope, finding a photograph of his father standing beside a horse that looked eerily like Thunder. Written on the back were the words, "Stay away." Terror and determination battled within Jacob as he clutched the photo. Whoever this man was, he knew something about John Sullivan, and Jacob wasn't about to stop searching for the truth. Would Jacob uncover the secrets of his father's past? Or would the journey cost him more than he was prepared to lose? How far would you go to uncover the truth about someone you've never met? Jacob thought he knew, but as whispers of danger closed in around him, his father's shadow grew darker, threatening to pull him into a world he didn't understand. The stranger's warning echoed in Jacob's mind long after the man had left the farm. The photograph, now hidden beneath his pillow, became both a source of comfort and torment. Every time Jacob looked at it, he felt a strange mix of pride and unease. His father was alive, that much was clear, but why would someone want to keep him hidden? As the days passed, Jacob's obsession with finding answers grew. Evelyn, sensing his restlessness, grew increasingly worried. She tried to distract him with chores and gentle reminders about their financial struggles, but Jacob's mind was elsewhere. One afternoon, while tending to Thunder, Jacob spotted Rosie approaching the barn. She carried her usual basket of baked goods, but her face was unusually serious. "I saw someone at your farm the other night," she began, her voice low. Jacob hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Yeah, he didn't stay long." Rosie frowned. "Did he say anything about your father?" Jacob's head snapped up. "How do you know it was about my father?" She sighed, sitting on a bale of hay. "Because men like that don't show up without a reason. And because I know more about your father than I've let on." Jacob's heart raced. "You knew him? Why didn't you tell me?" Rosie looked away, her eyes misty. "Your mother made me promise to stay quiet. She didn't want you tangled up in his past. But I think it's time you knew the truth." Rosie's story unfolded like a forgotten chapter of Jacob's life. Years ago, his father had been a celebrated horse trainer, known for turning even the most broken animals into champions. But his talents had drawn the wrong kind of attention. Wealthy gamblers, eager to exploit his skills, lured him into a world of high-stakes racing. When John refused to throw a race, he became a target. "That's why he left," Rosie explained. "To keep you and your mother safe." Jacob clenched his fists. "So he's out there somewhere, hiding, while we're struggling to survive?" "It wasn't an easy choice for him," Rosie said gently, "but he believed it was the only way to protect you." That night, Jacob confronted his mother. "Why didn't you tell me the truth about Dad?" he demanded, holding up the horseshoe and photograph. Evelyn sighed heavily, sitting at the kitchen table. "Because I didn't want you growing up with the same burdens he carried." "But he's still alive, isn't he?" Jacob pressed. "Yes," Evelyn admitted, tears in her eyes. But finding him won't change anything. He made his choices, Jacob, and we've made ours. Her words stung, but they didn't deter him. If anything, they fueled his determination. The next morning, Jacob decided to act. If his father had been a horse trainer, maybe someone at the auction house would remember him. He rode his bike into town, the photograph tucked safely in his pocket. At the auction house, Jacob approached the stable manager, a gruff man named Clyde. "Excuse me, sir," Jacob began, holding up the photo. "Do you recognize this man?" Clyde squinted at the picture, his expression hardening. "Where'd you get this?" "He's my father," Jacob said, trying to sound confident. Clyde let out a bitter laugh. "Your father, huh? That explains a lot." "What do you mean?" Jacob asked, his heart pounding. Clyde leaned in, his voice a harsh whisper. "If I were you, kid, I'd forget about him. That man made a lot of enemies, and some of them are still looking for payback." Before Jacob could ask more, Clyde waved him off. "You don't belong here. Go home before you get yourself into trouble." Confused and frustrated, Jacob returned to the farm. Thunder, sensing his agitation, nickered softly as Jacob approached the paddock. "I don't get it," Jacob muttered, stroking Thunder's mane. "Why would people still care about him after all these years?" As if in response, Thunder stamped his hoof, drawing Jacob's attention to a small, carved symbol on the post. It was faint but unmistakable, the same initials, JT, engraved into the wood. Jacob's breath caught. "Did my dad train you?" Thunder's ears twitched, and for the first time, Jacob felt a deeper connection to the horse. That evening, Jacob shared his findings with Rosie. Together, they examined the photograph and the initials. "Your father trained a lot of horses," Rosie said thoughtfully. "But Thunder, he's different. He was part of something bigger." "What do you mean?" Jacob asked. Rosie hesitated. "There were rumors back then about a horse John was working with. A horse that could outrun any other, even in impossible conditions. If Thunder is that horse, it's no wonder people want him kept out of sight." Jacob stared at Thunder, a mix of awe and fear in his chest. "So they're not just after my dad. They're after Thunder too." As the pieces began to fall into place, Jacob realized he was in over his head. But he also knew he couldn't stop now. Thunder wasn't just a horse. He was the key to understanding his father's past and securing their future. Late that night, Jacob sat alone in the barn, the photograph in one hand and Thunder's halter in the other. "We're going to figure this out," he whispered to the horse. "No matter what it takes." But as Jacob drifted off to sleep, he didn't notice the shadowy figure watching from the edge of the property, eyes fixed on the barn. Sometimes, the truth isn't hidden. It's buried. And when Jacob begins unearthing the secrets of his father's life, he discovers that the shadows cast by the past can be longer and darker than he ever imagined. Jacob woke to the sound of Thunder's restless movements in the barn. The horse pawed at the ground and snorted, his unease echoing through the crisp Kansas night. Jacob sat up in his bed, heart racing, as a chill ran down his spine. Something didn't feel right. Grabbing a flashlight, he crept out to the barn, his breath visible in the cool air. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges startling Thunder, who reared slightly before settling down at the sight of Jacob. "Easy, boy," Jacob whispered, running his hand along the horse's neck. But as he turned to check the stall, the beam of his flashlight landed on something that made his blood run cold. The initials JT had been freshly carved into the wooden frame of the barn door. Morning brought little comfort. Evelyn found Jacob sitting on the porch, clutching the photograph and staring into the distance. She didn't ask what was wrong. His tense posture and sleepless eyes told her enough. "Jacob," she began gently, sitting beside him. "Whatever you're trying to do, let it go. Your father's past is too dangerous." Jacob looked at her, his voice steady but firm. "If it's so dangerous, why did he leave it for us to deal with? Why didn't he take it with him?" Evelyn flinched, the words hitting harder than Jacob intended. "He thought he was protecting us," she said softly. "By running away?" Jacob shot back. He left us with nothing but questions and debt. Evelyn sighed, standing up. I've told you everything I can. Just be careful, Jacob. But careful wasn't on Jacob's mind. Determined to get answers, Jacob returned to the auction house that afternoon. He waited for Clyde to take a break, then approached him again, this time with a bolder plan. Mr. Clyde, I know my dad trained Thunder, Jacob said, holding the photograph out. And I know you know more than you're telling me. Clyde looked around, ensuring no one was listening, before jerking his head toward the stables. Come with me. Inside the stables, Clyde lit a cigarette, his gruff demeanor softening slightly. Your old man, John Sullivan. He was the best there was, but he didn't know when to quit. What do you mean? Jacob asked. Clyde exhaled slowly, the smoke curling in the air. He trained a horse, Thunder's sire, probably. That horse was unbeatable. But some people don't like losing. They made your dad an offer. Throw a race or pay the price. He refused. What happened next? Clyde's eyes darkened. Your dad disappeared before they could collect. But they didn't forget. If they know you're digging around, kid, you're painting a target on your back. Jacob swallowed hard, the weight of Clyde's words settling over him. What about Thunder? Why does he matter so much? Because he's proof, Clyde said. Proof that your dad didn't just leave. He was running from something bigger. Before Jacob could ask more, Clyde stubbed out his cigarette and walked away, muttering, Leave it alone, kid. On his way home, Jacob stopped by Rosie's house. She greeted him with her usual warm smile, but it faltered when she saw his expression. You found something, didn't you? She asked. Jacob nodded, recounting his conversation with Clyde. Rosie listened intently, her brow furrowing as he spoke. Thunder isn't just a horse, Jacob concluded. He's part of a legacy my dad left behind. And now someone's trying to take it away. Rosie sighed, standing to grab a faded leather-bound book from her shelf. Your father wasn't just a trainer, Jacob. He was a man of principles. He believed in doing the right thing even when it cost him everything. This book? It's a journal he gave me years ago before he left. I think it's time you read it. Jacob opened the journal with trembling hands, the pages filled with his father's neat handwriting. The entries painted a picture of a man torn between his love for his family and the threats looming over him. One passage stood out. I trained Thunder's sire to be more than a racer. He was a symbol of integrity in a world corrupted by greed. But symbols can be dangerous. They remind people of what they've lost and what they'll do to get it back. That night, Jacob sat in the barn with Thunder, the journal open on his lap. He read until his eyes burned, the weight of his father's words pressing on his chest. But as he turned the page, something unexpected slipped out, a folded piece of paper. Carefully unfolding it, Jacob found a map marked with a red X and the initials TF scrawled in the corner. What is this? Jacob muttered aloud. Suddenly, Thunder snorted and stomped his hoof, drawing Jacob's attention to the barn door. It was ajar, swinging slightly in the evening breeze. Hello, Jacob called out, his voice trembling. No answer. But when he stepped outside, he saw fresh footprints in the dirt, leading away from the barn and toward the woods. Unable to contain his curiosity, Jacob followed the tracks, the map clutched tightly in his hand. The woods were eerily quiet, each snap of a twig underfoot echoing in the stillness. The tracks led to a small clearing, where he found a crumpled piece of paper pinned to a tree with a rusty nail. It read, Turn back, or you'll regret it. Jacob's pulse quickened. Whoever left this warning knew exactly what he was doing. But Jacob couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to uncovering the truth. He tucked the note into his pocket and hurried back to the barn, his mind racing. Someone was watching him, trying to scare him away. But why? And what did TF on the map mean? As he lay in bed that night, Jacob stared at the ceiling, his father's words replaying in his mind. Symbols can be dangerous. Jacob didn't know who was after Thunder or why, but one thing was clear. The danger his father had run from was now at his doorstep. And this time, Jacob wouldn't back down. Jacob had always believed the answers he sought would bring him peace. But as the threads of his father's past unraveled, they revealed a tapestry woven with lies, danger, and sacrifice. Some truths, it seemed, came with a heavy price. The early morning light crept through the barn's wooden slats as Jacob stood in front of Thunder, map in hand. The initials TF haunted him, teasing at something just out of reach. He traced the red X on the map with his finger, wondering what lay hidden there. "You think this is where we'll find him?" Jacob asked softly. Thunder nickered, his dark eyes steady and calm. It was a silent affirmation, as if the horse knew they were on the brink of something big. Rosie arrived shortly after, carrying a thermos of coffee and a small tin of biscuits. She set them down on the barn's workbench and gave Jacob a wary look. "You've got that determined Sullivan look in your eyes," she said. "What's the plan?" "I'm going to follow this map," Jacob replied, his voice firm. "Whatever TF means, it's connected to my dad." Rosie hesitated. "I don't like this, Jacob. Whoever left that note in the woods knows you're looking. If you're not careful, you'll end up in the same trouble your father tried to protect you from." "I can't stop now, Rosie," Jacob said. "If my dad left this map, he wanted me to find it." She sighed, handing him a worn leather satchel. "Then at least take some supplies. And promise me you'll be careful." Jacob nodded, slinging the satchel over his shoulder. He glanced at Thunder, his heart pounding. "Let's go." The map led them west, toward the edge of town, where the flat farmland gave way to rolling hills and dense woods. Jacob walked beside Thunder, the horse's presence a steady comfort. The path grew rougher as they entered the forest, branches clawing at Jacob's clothes and the sound of rustling leaves filling the air. Hours passed before they reached a clearing marked by an old wooden sign. The letters were faded, but Jacob could make out the words. "Twin Falls, TF," he murmured, a chill running down his spine. Thunder pawed at the ground, as if urging Jacob to move forward. They followed a narrow trail that wound through the trees, the distant sound of rushing water growing louder with each step. Finally, they emerged onto a rocky outcrop overlooking two cascading waterfalls. Jacob's breath caught. The scene was beautiful, but something about it felt heavy, almost mournful. He scanned the area, searching for clues. Near the base of the waterfall, Jacob spotted a small metal box partially buried in the dirt. His hands trembled as he unearthed it and pried it open. Inside, he found a stack of letters, yellowed with age, and a photograph of his father standing beside a young woman Jacob didn't recognize. The letters were addressed to Evelyn, and as Jacob began reading, the words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Evelyn, I wish I could explain why I had to leave, but it's not safe. They're watching me, and I can't risk them finding you and Jacob. Twin Falls is the only place I trust to keep this safe. If anything happens to me, I hope he'll find it one day. Tell him I'm proud of him. Tell him I'm sorry." The letters painted a picture of a man tormented by his choices, torn between his love for his family and the danger that surrounded him. But they also revealed something else. His father had been working to expose a network of corrupt gamblers and trainers who exploited horses and their riders. "They wanted him to cheat," Jacob muttered, piecing the story together. But he refused. And when he tried to stop them, they turned on him. As Jacob folded the letters back into the box, a voice behind him made him freeze. Well, looks like you've been busy." Jacob turned slowly to see Mark, his rival from the auction, standing a few feet away. Behind him were two men Jacob didn't recognize, both with hard eyes and menacing postures. "What are you doing here?" Jacob demanded, his voice trembling. Mark smirked. "I could ask you the same thing. Word around town is you've been poking your nose where it doesn't belong. That's dangerous, kid." Jacob tightened his grip on the box. "You're after Thunder, aren't you?" "Thunder's just the beginning," Mark said, stepping closer. "Your dad had something we want, something he hid before he disappeared. And now, thanks to you, we're one step closer to finding it." Jacob's heart pounded as he backed away, but the two men blocked his escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Mark sneered. "Sure you don't. But you're going to tell us where that map leads, one way or another. Before Mark could grab the box, Thunder reared up with a loud whinny, kicking out at the men. Jacob took the chance to sprint toward the trail, clutching the box tightly. "Get him!" Mark shouted. Jacob's legs burned as he ran, the sound of heavy footsteps closing in behind him. He darted through the woods, branches tearing at his skin. Just as he thought they would catch him, Thunder galloped past, cutting between Jacob and his pursuers. The horse's powerful movements sent the men stumbling back, buying Jacob enough time to escape. By the time Jacob reached Rosie's house, he was shaking. Rosie pulled him inside, her eyes wide with alarm as he recounted what had happened. "They know about the map," Jacob said, his voice hoarse, "and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Rosie examined the letters and the photograph, her expression grim. "Your father wasn't just running from danger. He was trying to protect something bigger. Whatever he knew, whatever he was fighting against, it's still out there." Jacob stared at the letters, his resolve hardening. "Then I'll finish what he started." Rosie grabbed his hand, her voice urgent. "Jacob, listen to me. This is bigger than you. You can't take them on alone." "I'm not alone," Jacob said, glancing at Thunder through the window. "I have him, and I have you." Rosie's eyes softened, but her worry remained. "If you're going to fight this, you need to be smart. You need allies." Jacob nodded, though he wasn't sure where to start. All he knew was that he couldn't turn back now, not when the truth was finally within reach. As the sun set, casting the farm in shadow, Jacob realized that the battle ahead wouldn't just be about uncovering his father's past. It would be about protecting the future he and Thunder had fought so hard to build. In his quest for answers, Jacob finds himself walking a tightrope between trust and betrayal. With danger closing in, he must decide who to rely on, while his enemies lurk closer than he ever imagined. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jacob stood in the barn, running his hands along Thunder's mane. The horse had saved him the night before, and Jacob knew they were bonded in a way few could understand. "I don't know how we're going to do this," Jacob admitted, "but we have to try." Thunder snorted softly, as if urging Jacob to press on. Rosie joined them, carrying a stack of books and maps. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, setting them down on a nearby table. "If your father was trying to expose these people, he must have had someone helping him." Jacob furrowed his brow. "Like who?" Rosie tapped one of the books. "There's a man named Frank Mercer. He used to train horses with your father before things went bad. If anyone knows what your dad was up against, it's him." "Where is he now?" "Last I heard, he was running a small ranch near Dodge City," Rosie replied. "But be careful. Frank had his own share of trouble with these people." The journey to Dodge City was long and tense. Jacob rode Thunder through winding trails and dusty roads, the weight of the letters and map in his satchel a constant reminder of the danger he faced. When he arrived at the ranch, he found it in disrepair. The fences were broken, the barn leaning precariously to one side. Frank Mercer was sitting on the porch, a weathered man with a face like cracked leather. "What do you want, boy?" Frank asked, his voice gruff. "I'm John Sullivan's son," Jacob said, trying to sound confident. Frank's eyes narrowed. "Sullivan, huh? You've got guts showing up here. What are you after?" Jacob pulled out the letters and photograph, handing them to Frank. "My dad left these for me. I think he was trying to stop something bad. I need to know what happened." Frank studied the items in silence before letting out a long sigh. John was a good man, too good for the world he got mixed up in. If you're serious about following his trail, you'd better be ready for a fight. Inside Frank's rundown kitchen, Jacob learned more about his father's struggles. Frank explained how John had tried to expose a powerful gambling syndicate that rigged races and used horses like disposable tools. "They don't care about the animals, the riders, or the trainers," Frank said bitterly. "They only care about money. And when your dad refused to play their game, they came after him." Jacob clenched his fists. "Why didn't he fight back?" "He did," Frank said, his voice low. "But fighting them is like wrestling a bear. You might land a hit or two, but eventually it'll tear you apart. Frank agreed to help Jacob, but his warnings were clear. They would need more than courage to take on the syndicate. If you want to keep that horse safe, you'll need to be smart, Frank said. And you'll need people you can trust. Jacob thought of Rosie, her steadfast support a constant source of strength. I already have someone, he said. Good, Frank replied. You're going to need all the help you can get. As they planned their next move, Jacob noticed a photograph on the wall. It showed Frank and John standing beside a young man Jacob didn't recognize. Who's that? Jacob asked. Frank hesitated. That's Mason. He was one of us. Until he wasn't. What happened? He sold us out, Frank said bitterly. Told the syndicate everything. After that, John and I went our separate ways. We couldn't trust anyone anymore. Jacob's stomach turned. If Mason was still connected to the syndicate, he could be the one orchestrating the threats against him and Thunder. Back at the farm, Jacob shared what he'd learned with Rosie. She listened intently, her expression grim. Frank's right, she said. You can't do this alone. But if Mason is involved, you'll have to be careful. He'll know you're onto him. Jacob nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we need to find him before he finds us. The opportunity came sooner than Jacob expected. That evening, a sleek black car pulled up to the farm. A man stepped out, tall and impeccably dressed, his sharp features unmistakable. Mason, Rosie whispered, peeking out the window. Jacob's heart pounded as Mason approached the porch. He opened the door before Mason could knock, his hands clenched into fists. Jacob Sullivan, Mason said with a slick smile. I've been looking forward to meeting you. What do you want? Jacob demanded. Mason's smile widened. Your horse, and the map your father left you. Jacob's stomach churned, but he kept his voice steady. Why? What's so important about Thunder? Mason stepped closer, his voice lowering. That horse represents everything your father stood against. And if you're smart, you'll hand him over before you end up like him. I'm not afraid of you, Jacob said, though his trembling hands betrayed his words. You should be, Mason replied, because I'm not here to bargain. I'm here to take what's mine. Before Mason could move, Thunder let out a deafening whinny from the barn, his powerful frame charging toward the porch. Mason stepped back, startled, as Jacob used the distraction to slam the door shut. Rosie, take Thunder and go, Jacob shouted. What about you? She cried. I'll hold him off. Rosie hesitated, then nodded, running toward the barn as Thunder reared up, his hooves pounding the ground. Mason pounded on the door, his calm demeanor replaced by fury. You're making a big mistake, boy, he shouted. Jacob grabbed a chair, bracing it against the door. The only mistake was thinking I'd give up without a fight. Mason eventually retreated, but his parting words echoed in Jacob's mind. You can't hide forever, Sullivan. We'll be back. As the dust settled, Jacob joined Rosie and Thunder in the barn. His hands shook as he ran them along Thunder's mane, the weight of the encounter crashing down on him. We're not safe here anymore, Rosie said, her voice trembling. What are we going to do? Jacob looked at the map, then at Thunder. We keep moving. We find the truth. And we finish what my dad started. The road ahead was more dangerous than ever, but Jacob felt a newfound determination. He wasn't just fighting for his father's legacy. He was fighting for Thunder, for Rosie, and for himself. Jacob thought he'd made it through the worst, but the battle had only just begun. With enemies closing in and allies running out, he must decide how much he's willing to sacrifice to protect Thunder and uncover the truth about his father's legacy. The barn felt eerily quiet in the aftermath of Mason's visit. The once comforting creak of wood and rustle of hay now seemed ominous, like a ticking clock counting down to their next confrontation. Jacob sat on an overturned bucket, the map spread out in front of him, while Rosie paced back and forth. They'll be back, she said, her voice tight with fear. And next time, they won't ask nicely. Jacob nodded, his eyes fixed on the red X marked on the map. Then we have to get there first. What if it's a trap? Rosie asked. Then it's a chance we have to take, Jacob replied, determination hardening his voice. "This isn't just about me anymore. If they're willing to hurt people to cover up what my dad knew, we can't let them win." Rosie sighed, rubbing her temples. "You're so much like him. Stubborn, reckless, but brave." The journey to the map's final destination began at dawn, with Rosie riding in a borrowed pickup truck and Jacob leading Thunder along narrow trails. They made their way westward toward a remote area marked only as Silver Ridge. The air grew colder as they climbed, the dense woods giving way to rocky terrain. Jacob's boots slipped on loose stones, but Thunder's steady presence kept him going. Rosie drove slowly behind them, her worried gaze never straying far from Jacob. "What do you think we'll find up there?" Rosie asked during a brief stop. Jacob adjusted the straps on Thunder's saddle. "Answers. Or at least, something that proves my dad didn't just run away." They reached the ridge by late afternoon. The view was breathtaking, a sweeping panorama of valleys and distant mountains. But Jacob had no time to admire it. He scanned the area, his heart pounding as he recognized a small, dilapidated cabin nestled against the rocks. "That's it," he said, pointing. Rosie frowned. "Looks abandoned." "Maybe," Jacob said, "but it's the only place left to check." As they approached the cabin, Jacob noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. Someone had been there recently. He exchanged a worried glance with Rosie before stepping onto the creaky porch. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A cot, a wood stove, and a few shelves lined with dusty cans of food. But what caught Jacob's attention was a desk in the corner, its surface covered with papers and an old leather-bound notebook. Jacob opened the notebook, his breath catching as he recognized his father's handwriting. The entries were dated years ago and detailed his efforts to gather evidence against the syndicate. "They'll do anything to protect their operation," one entry read. "I'm close, but I can't risk Evelyn and Jacob. If they find me, it's over." Jacob flipped through the pages, his father's words painting a picture of a man consumed by fear but driven by a sense of justice. Then he found a page that made his heart stop. "The horse is the key. If anything happens to me, protect him at all costs." A sudden noise outside made Jacob freeze. The sound of tires crunching on gravel sent a jolt of fear through him. He peeked out the window to see a black car pulling up. "Mason," Jacob whispered, his stomach dropping. Rosie grabbed his arm. "We have to go. Now." "No," Jacob said, clutching the notebook. "We can't keep running. We have to end this." The cabin door burst open, and Mason stepped inside, flanked by two of his men. His sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Jacob. Well, Mason said with a smirk. "Looks like you found the family treasure." "You're not getting it," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Mason chuckled. "Oh, I think I will. You see, Jacob, your father made a mistake when he thought he could fight us. Don't make the same one." Jacob stood his ground. "You're wrong. My dad didn't make a mistake. He trusted the wrong people, but he never stopped fighting for what was right." Mason's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "Enough talking. Hand over the book and the horse, or we'll take them by force." Before Mason could move, Thunder let out a piercing whinny from outside, followed by the sound of hooves pounding against the ground. The noise startled Mason's men, giving Jacob the split second he needed to act. "Rosie, run," he shouted, shoving the notebook into his satchel. Rosie bolted out the back door while Jacob grabbed a heavy wooden chair, swinging it at Mason's men as they lunged toward him. The commotion gave Thunder just enough time to charge into the cabin, scattering the men like bowling pins. Jacob leapt onto Thunder's back, clinging to the horse's mane as they burst out of the cabin. Rosie was already in the truck, shouting for Jacob to follow. The chase through the ridge was chaotic. Mason and his men pursued them in the car, the engine roaring as they closed the distance. Jacob urged Thunder to run faster, the horse's powerful strides keeping them just ahead of the vehicle. "Hold on, Thunder," Jacob shouted, his heart pounding as they veered down a narrow path. The sound of gunshots shattered the air, and Jacob felt the sharp zing of a bullet grazing his arm. He winced but didn't slow down. Finally, Rosie's truck appeared at the edge of the trail. She opened the passenger door, shouting, "Get in!" Jacob slid off Thunder and climbed into the truck, pulling the horse in close beside them. Rosie floored the gas pedal, the truck careening down the dirt road. They didn't stop until they were miles away, the ridge nothing but a distant memory. Jacob slumped in the seat, clutching his injured arm, while Rosie panted from the adrenaline. "You okay?" she asked. Jacob nodded, though his body trembled. "We have the notebook," he said, "and Thunder's safe. That's all that matters." Rosie glanced at him, her expression torn. "This isn't over, Jacob. Mason won't stop until he gets what he wants." "Then we'll have to be ready," Jacob said, determination glinting in his eyes. As night fell, they found refuge in an old barn on the outskirts of a small town. While Rosie bandaged Jacob's arm, he studied the notebook, searching for the answers his father had died protecting. One entry caught his attention. "The truth is hidden in plain sight. Follow the stars and you'll find it." Jacob frowned, the words filling him with both hope and dread. The stars his father mentioned could mean anything, but whatever they led to, Jacob knew it would come at a price. For now, though, he had Thunder, Rosie, and the notebook. And for the first time, he felt like he wasn't just running, he was fighting back. Guided by his father's cryptic words, Jacob embarks on a dangerous journey into the unknown. As secrets come to light, he must decide how far he's willing to go to protect those he loves, and whether he's ready to face the ultimate truth. The barn was quiet except for the gentle rustling of hay and the rhythmic breathing of Thunder, who rested in the stall beside Jacob. Moonlight streamed through cracks in the wooden slats, painting the floor with streaks of silver. Jacob stared at the notebook in his lap, his father's words swimming in his mind. "The truth is hidden in plain sight. Follow the stars and you'll find it." He traced the words with his finger, frustration building. What did his father mean by "follow the stars"? The phrase seemed like a riddle with no answer, and time was running out. Mason would regroup and the next attack would be worse. Rosie's voice broke through his thoughts. "You've been staring at that thing for hours. Any luck?" Jacob shook his head. "I don't even know where to start." Rosie sat beside him, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. "Your dad was a clever man. If he said the truth is hidden in plain sight, then maybe the answer is simpler than you think." Jacob sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Simpler? It feels like everything about this is impossible." Rosie gave him a small smile. "Sometimes, when you can't see the whole picture, you need to step back. Let yourself breathe, Jacob. The answer will come." The next morning, as sunlight warmed the barn, Jacob decided to follow Rosie's advice. He took Thunder out for a walk along a quiet trail, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. As they climbed a hill overlooking the countryside, Jacob stopped to rest. He pulled out the notebook, flipping through its pages for the 100th time. His eyes landed on the phrase again, "Follow the stars." Jacob glanced up at the sky. The sun shone brightly overhead, and for a moment he felt foolish. But then something caught his eye. A cluster of trees in the distance arranged in a peculiar pattern. They formed the shape of a star. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be a coincidence? Or had his father left another clue? Jacob returned to the barn, excitement coursing through him. Rosie was tending to Thunder when he burst in, waving the notebook. "I think I found something," he said, breathless. Rosie raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" "There's a grove of trees a few miles from here," Jacob explained. "They're shaped like a star. What if that's what my dad meant?" Rosie frowned, wiping her hands on a rag. "It's a long shot, Jacob. Are you sure it's worth the risk?" "What choice do we have?" Jacob asked. "Mason's out there, and he's not going to stop. If this is a clue, we need to follow it." Rosie hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we go together. No more running off on your own." The grove was even more striking up close. The trees, tall and ancient, formed a perfect five-pointed star when viewed from above. At the center of the grove was a clearing, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. Jacob and Rosie searched the area, their movements careful and deliberate. Thunder grazed nearby, his ears twitching as if sensing something unusual. "Do you see anything?" Jacob asked, brushing aside a tangle of vines. "Nothing yet," Rosie replied, crouching to examine the ground. "But this place feels important." Jacob knelt beside her, his hands combing through the dirt. He felt a small bump beneath his fingers and dug deeper, uncovering a rusted metal box. His breath caught. "This has to be it." Inside the box, Jacob found a collection of documents, photographs, and a small leather pouch. The documents were ledgers, detailing the syndicate's operations, names, dates, and amounts that painted a damning picture of corruption and greed. "This is it," Jacob said, his voice trembling. "This is what my dad was trying to expose." Rosie picked up a photograph, her eyes widening. "Jacob, look." The photo showed John Sullivan standing beside Mason. They were younger, smiling, and shaking hands. "What does this mean?" Jacob asked, confusion and betrayal swirling in his chest. "It means your father and Mason weren't always enemies," Rosie said softly. As they examined the rest of the documents, a clearer picture emerged. John and Mason had once worked together to take down the syndicate. But somewhere along the way, Mason had switched sides, selling out John to protect himself. "That's why Mason's after us," Jacob realized. "He knows these records could ruin him." Rosie nodded. "And if we don't act fast, he'll make sure we don't live to use them." Their sense of triumph was short-lived. As they packed up the box, the sound of engines roared in the distance. "They found us," Rosie said, her voice tight with fear. Jacob's heart raced. "We need to move. Now." They loaded the documents onto Thunder's saddle and prepared to flee. But the black cars arrived before they could escape. Mason stepped out, flanked by his men, his expression colder than ever. "I warned you, Jacob," Mason said, his voice venomous. "You should have stayed out of this." Jacob stood his ground, his fear replaced by anger. "You betrayed my father. You betrayed everything he stood for." Mason smirked. "Your father was a fool. He thought he could take us down. But all he did was destroy himself. And now you're following in his footsteps." Before Mason could make his move, Thunder reared up, letting out a fierce whinny. The distraction gave Rosie enough time to grab the leather pouch from the box and toss it to Jacob. "Run!" she shouted. Jacob hesitated, torn between fighting and fleeing. But as Mason's men advanced, he knew he had no choice. He vaulted onto Thunder's back, clutching the pouch as the horse charged through the grove. The chase was chaotic, the narrow paths making it difficult for Mason's cars to keep up. Jacob guided Thunder with precision, weaving through trees and leaping over fallen logs. They didn't stop until they reached a neighboring farm, where Jacob hid the pouch in an old feed bin. Thunder was panting, his coat slick with sweat, but his eyes were bright and determined. Rosie arrived shortly after, her clothes torn but her spirit intact. "We made it," she said, her voice shaky. "For now," Jacob replied, his hands trembling as he pulled the pouch from its hiding place. Inside was a key and a note in his father's handwriting. "The truth lies where it began." Jacob stared at the words, realization dawning. "He means the farm. Everything started there." Rosie nodded. "Then that's where we'll finish it." With their next destination clear, Jacob felt a mix of fear and hope. The truth was within reach, but the cost of uncovering it could be greater than he ever imagined. Every road Jacob had taken, every clue uncovered, had led him back to the one place he thought he understood, the farm. But as the past came to light, Jacob realized that home held more than just memories. It held the key to his father's legacy, and a truth that could change everything. The journey back to the farm was tense, the weight of their discovery pressing on Jacob and Rosie like a storm cloud. Thunder trotted steadily beside the truck, his powerful frame a comforting presence amid the turmoil. Jacob clutched the key from the leather pouch in his hand, the edges digging into his palm. "The truth lies where it began," he thought, replaying his father's words over and over. The farm had always been his sanctuary, but now it felt like a labyrinth of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Rosie broke the silence. "We need a plan. Mason won't give up." And if he finds us before we figure this out? Jacob nodded, his jaw tight. We'll hide the documents in the barn. If anything happens, they'll still be safe. And the key? Rosie asked. Jacob stared out at the horizon, the distant outline of the farm coming into view. I think I know where it goes. The sun was setting by the time they reached the farm. The familiar sight of the weathered house and barn brought a wave of emotion crashing over Jacob. This was the place where his life had been simple, where his dreams had been small and his worries few. But now, it was the epicenter of a battle he hadn't asked for but couldn't abandon. Rosie helped him unload the documents, tucking them into a hidden compartment beneath the barn floor. Your father was clever, she said, closing the hatch. Let's hope we're just as smart. Jacob took a deep breath and walked toward the barn's back wall, where a small rusted lock had always hung. He had never thought much of it before. It was just a relic, something that had been there as long as he could remember. He slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and with a soft click, the hidden door creaked open. Behind the wall was a small, secret room. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of wood and oil lingered. Inside were shelves lined with old ledgers, photographs, and a metal safe. Jacob's heart pounded as he opened the safe, revealing stacks of neatly organized papers and a reel of film. What is this? Rosie asked, stepping inside. Jacob picked up a ledger, flipping through its pages. It was a detailed account of the syndicate's activities, far more comprehensive than the documents they had found at Twin Falls. The film reel was labeled Evidence. 1934 race scandal. This is everything, Jacob whispered. It's enough to take them down. Rosie's face lit with hope, but it quickly faded. If we can get it to the right people. Mason won't let this go without a fight. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of engines approaching. Jacob's stomach dropped. He and Rosie exchanged a panicked glance before rushing to close the hidden room. Thunder let out a warning whinny as the black cars pulled up, their headlights piercing the gathering darkness. Mason stepped out, his face a mask of cold determination. I gave you every chance to walk away, he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. But you just couldn't leave well enough alone. Jacob stepped out of the barn, his hands clenched into fists. This is my family's home. You don't get to take it from us. Mason chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Your father thought the same thing. Look where it got him. Rosie appeared at Jacob's side, her shoulders squared. You've got no right to be here, she said, her voice steady. Mason smirked. I have every right. That evidence belongs to us. Jacob took a step forward, his anger boiling over. You don't care about the evidence. You care about covering up the truth. Well, guess what? The truth is out, and you can't stop it. Mason's smile vanished, replaced by a dangerous glint in his eye. You're a brave kid, I'll give you that. But bravery doesn't win battles. Power does. He gestured to his men who advanced toward the barn. Before they could get far, Thunder charged out of his stall, his powerful hooves thundering against the ground. The sight of the massive horse startled Mason's men, who scrambled to dodge his path. Now! Rosie shouted, pulling Jacob back toward the house. They ran inside, locking the door behind them. Jacob grabbed the evidence and the film reel, stuffing them into a satchel. What are we going to do? Rosie asked, her voice shaking. Jacob's mind raced. We need to get this to someone who can help. The police, the newspapers, anyone who can take them down. And how do we get past Mason? Jacob glanced out the window, where Thunder was still circling the yard, keeping the men at bay. We use him. The plan was risky, but they had no other choice. While Mason's men were distracted, Jacob saddled Thunder and climbed onto his back. Rosie handed him the satchel, her eyes filled with worry. Be careful, she said. I will, Jacob promised. I'll come back for you. Thunder reared up, letting out a fierce whinny, and then they were off. Jacob guided the horse toward the back field, his heart pounding as they raced through the darkness. Mason quickly realized what was happening. Stop them, he shouted, his men scrambling to pursue. The chase was chaotic, the headlights of the cars cutting through the fields as Thunder leapt over fences and dodged obstacles. Jacob held on tightly, the satchel bouncing against his side. "Come on, Thunder," he urged. Just a little farther. The cars gained ground, and Jacob felt a surge of panic. But then he spotted the old railway bridge up ahead. It was narrow and dangerous, but it was their only chance. Thunder hesitated for a moment, sensing the danger, but Jacob leaned forward, his voice steady. "We can do this, boy. Trust me." With a burst of speed, Thunder charged onto the bridge. The sound of his hooves echoed against the wooden planks as the cars skidded to a halt behind them, unable to follow. Jacob let out a shaky breath as they reached the other side, the lights of the cars fading into the distance. He leaned down, patting Thunder's neck. "Good job, buddy. We did it." They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town. Jacob dismounted, his legs shaky, and made his way to the police station. The officer on duty listened intently as Jacob explained everything, handing over the satchel and the film reel. "This is enough to bring them down," the officer said, his expression grave. "You're a brave kid, Jacob. Your father would be proud." Jacob felt a lump in his throat but managed a nod. "It's not over yet. Mason's still out there. We'll take care of him," the officer promised. As dawn broke, Jacob and Thunder stood outside the station, watching the first rays of sunlight light up the sky. For the first time in weeks, Jacob felt a sense of relief. But he knew the fight wasn't truly over. Not yet. With the evidence in the hands of the authorities, Jacob thought the hardest part of his journey was behind him. But as Mason tightens his grip, Jacob realizes that the battle for justice and survival has only just begun. The ride back to the farm was quiet, the early morning light casting long shadows across the fields. Thunder moved at a steady pace, his exhaustion evident in the way his hooves dragged slightly. Jacob patted the horse's neck, murmuring words of encouragement. "You've been through so much, boy," he said softly. "We're almost there." When the familiar outline of the barn came into view, Jacob's stomach twisted with anxiety. He had left Rosie behind to face Mason and his men alone, trusting that the authorities would intervene quickly. Now every instinct screamed at him to hurry. He urged Thunder into a gallop, the horse responding with a burst of energy as they approached the farmhouse. The sight that greeted Jacob was both a relief and a shock. Mason's cars were gone, and the yard was quiet, but the barn doors hung ajar, and smoke rose faintly from a small fire smoldering in the grass. "Rosie!" Jacob shouted, leaping off Thunder's back and sprinting toward the house. The door was unlocked, and Jacob burst inside to find Rosie sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Her face was pale, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Jacob!" she exclaimed, rising to meet him. "Are you okay?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They left a few hours ago. I don't know why, but they just gave up." Jacob frowned, his mind racing. Mason didn't seem like the kind of man to walk away without getting what he wanted. "What happened?" Rosie hesitated. "One of his men got spooked. They said something about the police being on their way, and Mason decided to cut his losses. But, Jacob, I don't think this is over." Rosie's words proved prophetic. As the day wore on, an oppressive tension settled over the farm. Jacob and Rosie worked together to repair the barn doors and clean up the mess Mason's men had left behind. But both knew it was only a matter of time before he returned. The first sign came at sunset. A shadow moved at the edge of the field, just visible in the fading light. Jacob's heart raced as he stepped outside, scanning the horizon. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. The shadow didn't respond, but a moment later, the familiar growl of an engine shattered the silence. A single black car rolled up the driveway, stopping just short of the porch. Mason stepped out, his expression colder and more dangerous than Jacob had ever seen. "Did you really think this was over?" Mason asked, his voice calm but dripping with menace. Jacob stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. "The police have the evidence. It's over for you. Mason chuckled, the sound low and menacing. You're a clever boy, Jacob, but you've underestimated me. That evidence won't see the light of day. I have people in high places who will make sure of that. Rosie appeared in the doorway, her face pale but defiant. You can't scare us, Mason. The truth is out there now. You've already lost. Mason's eyes narrowed. I don't need to win. I just need to make sure you lose. Before Jacob could respond, Mason's men emerged from the shadows, surrounding the barn and house. Thunder let out a loud whinny, rearing up in his stall as the tension reached its breaking point. What do you want? Jacob demanded. Mason smirked. The horse. And you. Surrender quietly, and maybe I'll let the old lady go. Jacob's anger flared, but Rosie grabbed his arm, her voice low. We have to think smart. Don't let him bait you. Jacob took a deep breath, his mind racing. If they gave up Thunder, Mason would destroy the horse and the legacy he represented. But if they fought back, they risked losing everything. An idea struck him. You want Thunder? Fine, but you'll have to catch him first. Before Mason could react, Jacob darted into the barn, releasing Thunder from his stall. The horse charged out, his powerful hooves striking the ground like thunderclaps. Chaos erupted as Mason's men scrambled to catch the horse, their movements clumsy and frantic. Jacob used the distraction to grab a pitchfork, brandishing it like a weapon as he stood between Mason and the house. You're outnumbered, boy, Mason sneered, pulling a gun from his coat. Jacob's stomach twisted, but he stood his ground. You don't scare me. The standoff was broken by the wail of sirens in the distance. Mason's men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. This isn't over, Mason snarled, lowering his gun. You've made a powerful enemy today, Jacob Sullivan. As the police cars rolled into the yard, Mason and his men retreated, disappearing into the night. Relief washed over Jacob as the officers approached, their presence a reassuring reminder that he wasn't alone. He explained everything. Mason's threats, the hidden evidence, and the sacrifices his father had made to protect the truth. The officers listened intently, their determination mirroring Jacob's. We'll make sure Mason and his men are brought to justice, one of them promised. Jacob nodded, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Thank you. That night, the farm was quiet once more. Jacob sat outside with Rosie, staring up at the stars. Thunder grazed nearby, his dark coat glistening in the moonlight. You did it, Rosie said softly. We did it, Jacob corrected, a small smile tugging at his lips. Rosie leaned back, her gaze fixed on the sky. Your father would be so proud of you, Jacob. You've carried on his fight, and won. Jacob felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. It's not over yet, but at least now we have a chance. The stars above seemed brighter than ever, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was always a glimmer of hope. The fight for justice has left Jacob changed forever. With the truth finally revealed, he must face the consequences of his actions and decide what kind of future he wants to build. For himself, for Thunder, and for the legacy his father left behind. The morning after Mason's retreat, the farm felt eerily peaceful. Jacob stood by the paddock, watching Thunder graze under the pale light of dawn. The horse's calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside Jacob. Rosie joined him, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. She handed it to Jacob, her expression a mix of pride and concern. How are you feeling? She asked. Jacob shrugged, his eyes never leaving Thunder. I don't know. Relieved, I guess. But tired. Rosie nodded knowingly. You've been through more than most adults ever face, Jacob. It's okay to feel that way. Jacob sipped the coffee, the warmth grounding him. Do you think it's really over? Rosie sighed. Mason's still out there, but with the police involved, he won't be able to come after you so easily. And the evidence you handed over? It's enough to bring down his entire operation. Jacob wanted to believe her, but a part of him couldn't shake the fear that Mason would find a way back into their lives. Later that day, Sheriff Harris, the lead officer on the case, arrived at the farm. He brought news that filled Jacob with both relief and uncertainty. "We've arrested several of Mason's men," Harris explained. "They're already talking, and it's only a matter of time before we have enough to take Mason down for good." Jacob nodded, his heart lighter at the thought. "What about the documents and the film reel?" Harris smiled. "They're in safe hands. We've contacted a journalist who's been investigating the syndicate for years. Once this story breaks, there'll be nowhere for Mason to hide." The sheriff placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You've done more than anyone could have asked, son. Your father would be proud." Jacob swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding silently. With the immediate danger behind them, life on the farm began to settle into a new rhythm. Jacob threw himself into caring for Thunder, who had become not just his companion, but a symbol of everything he had fought for. The townsfolk, who had once mocked Jacob for buying a broken horse, began to see him in a new light. Neighbors stopped by to offer their support, bringing food, tools, and even help with repairs to the barn. One evening, Mr. Clyde, the gruff stable manager, arrived with a small wooden box. "I found this in my office," Clyde said, handing the box to Jacob. "Thought you might want it." Inside was a trophy, tarnished but still gleaming, engraved with the words, "John Sullivan and Stormbreaker, Champions of Integrity, 1934. Jacob's breath caught. "This was my dad's?" Clyde nodded. "He earned it the year before everything went south. Figured it belongs with his family." Jacob held the trophy tightly, a wave of emotion washing over him. Weeks turned into months, and the story of Jacob's fight against the syndicate spread far beyond the town. Reporters came to the farm, eager to interview the young boy who had stood up to powerful criminals. Jacob answered their questions carefully, always emphasizing the bravery of those who had helped him: Rosie, Thunder, and even his late father. One afternoon, as Jacob was working in the barn, Rosie appeared with a letter in her hand. "It's from the journalist," she said, handing it to him. Jacob opened the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. The letter was short but powerful. "Jacob, thanks to your courage and the evidence you provided, we've exposed one of the largest race-fixing operations in the country. The story will run tomorrow. Your father's name will be cleared, and the syndicate's influence is already crumbling. You've given countless people hope. Never forget that. Sincerely, Charles Bennett." Jacob read the letter twice, his chest swelling with pride. "He did it," he said softly. "My dad. He didn't give up." As the story broke nationwide, the farm became a beacon of resilience. People traveled from neighboring towns and beyond to meet Jacob and Thunder, to hear their story and share their admiration. Rosie, ever the protective matriarch, made sure Jacob stayed grounded. "You've done something incredible," she told him one evening, "but don't forget who you are. This farm, this life. It's what your father would have wanted for you." Jacob nodded, her words settling deeply within him. One day, as Jacob was walking through the pasture with Thunder, he paused to look at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting the fields in a golden glow. "I wish you could see this, Dad," he whispered. "I wish you could see what we've done." He felt a gentle nudge at his back and turned to see Thunder, his dark eyes filled with understanding. "You're right," Jacob said, smiling. "We've got work to do." The farm thrived in the years that followed. Jacob grew into a strong, compassionate young man, taking on the responsibility of running the land and caring for Thunder. He used the notoriety from their story to advocate for better treatment of horses and riders, ensuring his father's legacy lived on in ways he could be proud of. Rosie remained by his side, her wisdom and warmth a constant source of guidance. On a quiet evening, Jacob stood in the barn, the old trophy sitting on a shelf beside his father's notebook. He ran his fingers over the engraved words, a sense of peace settling over him. "You did good, Dad," he said softly, "and I'll keep doing good. For you, for Thunder, and for us." Outside, the stars shone brightly, the same stars his father had followed so many years ago. Jacob smiled, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he had the strength to face them.